It's game time from the locker room. I have NFL three-time Coach of the Year, Atlanta Falcons, former head coach Mike Smith. We have a special guest today, Super Bowl winning coach Brian Billick. And so really excited to have Brian on here. I think he has some great lessons that he's going to share with us. And I know you spent some time with Brian. Mike is one of his assistants. So why don't you introduce Brian?
Yeah, well, you know, Brian and I have worked together for a long time, starting back at San Diego State. And, you know, I owe Brian a whole lot. You know, I think one of our earlier podcasts, we talked about, you know, who affected your career the most. And Brian Billick is the guy that I think did. We met way back at San Diego State in 1981. And I owe a lot to him in terms of not only my coaching career, but also my personal life. He introduced me to my wife, and he can tell the story about how that all happened. But he's taught me a whole lot, and I'm looking forward today of just sitting down and having a conversation with B. How you doing, Brian?
I am doing great, and I appreciate the kind words. I think I got more out of the process than you did, because I got a heck of a coach and a good brother-in-law. Because you get around those family meetings now, there's only so much time that you don't. At some point, you need to cull yourself out and get to talking some football.
Absolutely, Brian, especially with all those women that are in our family.
That's right.
No boys. So we get to, hey, we can slide out and we can talk some X's and O or talk some philosophy.
Hey, well, that's great. But, you know, one of the things that I always wondered, Brian, you know, clearly, you had a great career. And, you know, I think everybody understands that, you know, I guess your brand was kind of developed as one of the, you know, the great offensive minds in both college football, of course, when you were at Stanford with Coach Green and then with the Minnesota Vikings. And then, you know, you get an opportunity to go to the Ravens as the head coach. So what were the first couple things that you really instituted, or as you kind of evaluated, you know, where the Ravens were? What were a couple things you did right away that you thought really, you know, kind of got you headed in the right direction?
Well, as usual, it's an interesting process. When I was leaving the Vikings, I was very fortunate, given some of the success that we had offensively, that there were multiple offers and opportunities at the time. And it came down to Baltimore and Cleveland. And again, not by any design on my part, but you got to remember the history of the two clubs. That Cleveland, Art Modell had left, taken it to Baltimore. They reconstituted the Cleveland Browns. So the natural rivalry between the two, it got very competitive in terms of the hiring process. And ultimately, I decided to go with Baltimore, mostly because of Ozzie Newsome. And Mike, of course, was there with us for years with Ozzie, Hall of Fame player that if you can go in the Hall of Fame twice, Ozzie Newsome will, because he's a Hall of Fame general manager. And just felt like the circumstances in Baltimore. But I always do say it's amazing, and Mike knows this, you spend your entire professional career preparing for becoming a head coach, and you draw on the experiences of the people you work with, both good and bad. You know, there's things, some coaches you go, oh, boy, if I get to be a head coach, I'm going to make sure I do this. And there's some others that you go, boy, if I ever become a head coach, I'm definitely not going to do that. And you prepare for the interview process in painstaking degree in terms of how you're going to articulate your program and how you're going to present yourself. And then you get the job and you sit down in that chair and you realize, holy mackerel, I got no idea what I'm doing. I mean, you know, now that the decisions, you know, do lie with you, but you just kind of kick into, okay, well, I've got to do this first. Obviously, the priorities, and for me, there are a lot of priorities. Certainly putting your staff together is number one. That's going to be the most important thing you do, is who are you bringing into the organization, particularly for me, an organization that was a new organization, had not had a winning season since its inception, and needed, as we hear all the time, needed some institutional change, needed to change the culture. And the only way you're going to do that is with the people you bring in to the organization that are going to implement those things that you know, that you believe in. And that's where Coach Smith was huge for me. I only kept one guy off the existing staff, Marvin Lewis, who everybody knows, a heck of a coach, went on to become successful coach of the Cincinnati Bengals and a heck of a coach. And he was the only one that was the leftover. And I brought in, on the defensive side, some strong personalities for Marvin to have to deal with. Jack Del Rio, a former player. Steve Schaefer, a long time in the NFL as a secondary coach. Rex Ryan, who we all know has a very strong personality. So there were a lot of personalities to deal with for Marvin. One of the reasons I brought Mike in, besides being, I know, a heck of a coach, because of our relationship over the years, I knew that Smitty knew the teaching process that I wanted to install. And that was going to be the biggest input. Being primarily an offensive guy, I could take care of that. But I needed to know that there was someone on a day-to-day basis on the defensive side with Marvin that understood the teaching sequence, the one that I had learned from Bill Walsh and Denny Green that I felt was at the basis of any success that we had had. I wanted to integrate that teaching and preparation process with the coaches, and Mike was the perfect conduit with Marvin, and Marvin found very quickly that he could rely on Mike, not only for some great perspectives and great football, but could understand via Mike the way I wanted this done. And so that was probably job one in getting the coaches around you, in changing that culture that then permeates out to the entire organization. And then it comes down to the communication process, whether it's with personnel, administration. We had an interesting setup in Baltimore where the football side was up in Owings Mills, but the administrative side was downtown Baltimore. So bridging those silos that naturally get created when you have a physical setup like that was one of the biggest challenges early on as well.
It's kind of interesting to hear that, it sounds like everything you did was very strategic and there was a reason, and you kind of, can you talk a little bit about that, of how I think one of the things that leaders have to do is they have to create that vision, and they have to not only create the vision, but they have to create the steps so that vision becomes a reality. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and part of that also is there becomes a proving ground for the players and the organization that validates what you're doing. I mean, you come in, you're organized, you have structure, you believe in what you're doing, but you see it in today's game. We've got a couple teams playing this weekend in Cincinnati and Cleveland. You talk about a pressurized league. You're talking about a must-win in week 2, because both Kevin Stefanski and Zach Taylor, the head coaches of Cleveland and Cincinnati, are at that point where they've got to have some success to validate to their players and organization, we know what we're doing. And that's important. That's a tough bridge to cross, because you have to nurture. The players have to understand and know that you're going to take care of them and that they ought to listen to you. But then it has to show up on the field. Now, we were very fortunate in that we ended up winning a Super Bowl in the second year. But even in the first year, even though it was moderate success, we went 8-8, which doesn't sound very ambitious, but it's the first time they'd had a non-losing season since the inception of the Ravens. So that took us a big step in terms of, okay, yeah, we kind of know what we're doing. The players needed to know. It was a basic fundamental of my background, coming from Denny Green and Bill Walsh, was you got to take care of the players. And the players have to know that. I don't mean kowtow to the players. I don't mean become the players' coach where they, the inmates are running the asylum, so to speak, but that they recognize you are going to do things in their best interest. The way we practice and the way we put keeping the players fresh and healthy as a prime directive. Remember Bill Walsh, when I started with Bill, the same John Wooden-esque same speech every year with the coaches. Your job when we start training camp is to get the players to the opener healthy and fresh. Now, we got a lot of other things we got to do, and you're going to be held responsible for a lot of other things. But your job one that I'm going to measure your competency in is getting the players to the opener healthy and fresh. So by setting those priorities, the coaches understood, and then the players eventually understood And then now, obviously, at the end of the day, you got to have good players. My good friend Mike Robinson, who I work with at the network, is always fond of saying this is a game of Jimmy and Joe's, not X's and O's. And he's right. I mean, you've got to have players, but at the end of the day, your opponents have good players too. So you differentiate yourself by the structure you have, the belief, and we used to call it drinking the Kool-Aid, singing to the hymn, preaching to the choir, in terms of having that Ravens way. We used to have a saying on our draft board on the very top that said, "Those that won't are no better than those that can't." Meaning that talent's all well and good, but if they're not going to give themselves over to the process, then you're not going to be very successful. It's why a good, solid regular team will beat an all-star team every time. Because even though the all-star team has great talent, they may not have the structure or the commitment and connectivity to the team as a whole, and they don't play as a team. So that constant mantra of, and it begins every year. It's not like, okay, we got it at this point, now we're good, and we just go. It's kind of like a marriage. Every year it's like, okay, let's start over. Let's reconnect. Let's reconnect with our priorities. Because you do, as in college ball, where you have that programmable, you lose about a quarter of your team every year due to graduation and the like. In the NFL, it's getting close to about the same. That attrition, because of the cap and the CBA, it's close to 20-25%. And so you better have a structure that you reconnect with those base principles you're trying to sell, that they can integrate the new players coming in, because it's a lot easier for them to communicate it than for you, and accelerate that process for the players you're bringing in. And it's an all-day sucker. It is not a stand up in front of the team, one shot, here's what we're doing, and let it happen. It is a day by day. I've always said, if I were to go back into coaching, people always say, well, Coach, would you go back into coaching? And my pat line is, they're looking for young and cheap, and I'm neither. Okay, so that's not going to happen. But if I were, I would view, and I learned this as much in coaching as I did when I left coaching. I spent 6 years with Fox doing games, which led me to every weekend I was going into facilities, watching practice, visiting with players and coaches and administrators, and then visiting with the opposing team. And I learned almost as much there as I did in the previous years coaching. And I always said, if I were to go back in coaching, you do three things. One, you bring together the best staff that you can. We talked about that. And we were pretty successful at that. We had 9 guys going to become head coaches. You develop a base system that you present a structure to the players so they can lean on that structure. And then finally, as the head coach, my job would be to spend every day pushing my players toward the direction of my coaches, because they're the ones that are going to, preach to the choir, so to speak, and get that message across. And that means almost player by player, that you have to connect with them. We used to have a saying, they don't care what you know until they know that you care. And showing them, yeah, I do care about you, and this is why you ought to listen to your coach.
I think it's really interesting. I don't want to monopolize this, and I'm sure Mike has a couple questions or thoughts, but I thought, that's a huge point that I think that you brought up for a lot of leaders, is that, you really need to build equity. People need to believe in you, and you've got to have success, and I think part of that is, you got to celebrate, small victories, and, you kind of got to build on that. It sounds like, like you did that first year at Baltimore, it wasn't a huge success, but you had success. People started to believe. And I think as leaders, you need to realize you need to have success. If not, people pretty much just get disconnected. And I know, Mike, you probably did that with the Falcons too.
Yeah, Doc, you've got to get the guys believing in what you're doing. And I learned so much in my time at Baltimore, not only from Brian, but from the other members of the staff. And guys have completely different outlooks on life, and some are very serious, some are very happy-go-lucky. But the thing I think that we did as a staff, and what Brian did, is he was very organized in terms of how we were going to approach our week and our season. You know, I know Brian has worked with Bill Walsh, and it comes from Bill Walsh's philosophies as well. But it was very clear. We knew as a staff, when we came into a staff meeting, that we were going to get the messaging for the day or the messaging for the week. And I think that's the one thing that I learned was you've got to be clear with the messaging for your players. And Brian laid it out every week and every day. And we had a football team that by the end of camp, we were all saying the same things. We were all rowing the boat, to use another coach's thing. We're all rowing the boat in the same direction. And it's, you know, and it's so important. And the other thing that I think that coaches have to really work at is they've got to be prepared for those bumps in the roads. It's not a straight road. There's too many things going on, and you're going to have to deal with them. And Brian and the staff there, and with the experiences that they had, we were able to, you know, go through a lot of bumps in the road. And when you can handle those and keep everybody focused on really what the goal is and go that direction, that's what I think that staff was great at. And there were so many different personalities on the staff. There were so many different personalities on the team. You know, as Brian will tell you, that 2000 championship team was a cast of characters. And it was probably the funnest time for me as a coach. Of course, we had the most success that I've ever had. But when you've got guys that come together and believe, it is the biggest strength that you can have on a football team.
So, Brian, how about that? You know, you had some guys on there, and, you know, I'm not all that familiar with it, but I kind of remember some of those guys, me being a Cincinnati native and somewhat long-time suffering Cincinnati Bengals fan, although, you know, that's a pretty tough conference with, you know, the Steelers and the Ravens, and there for a while the Bengals. But how do you deal with those guys, like, you know, big, strong personalities? I'm sure, you know, I guess the one guy that kind of, just when you talk about the Ravens, is Ray Lewis, and how you just see how dynamic and how forceful he was. I guess it's so important to get those leaders on the team to buy in and be your, you know, I guess your emissaries or your ambassadors, so the rest of the guys follow. How did you deal with those guys? They're all coming from different backgrounds. They have different desires. And I guess you throw in the money deal too. I guess that all gets to be a little challenging.
Yeah, there's very few places more diverse than an NFL locker room, and to bring them all together with a lot of different agendas. Like you said, the money is going to be a factor. That's one of the things that you can't naively just say, well, we're not going to worry about that. That's not it. It is real. It is very real. And you don't dwell on it, but you have to account for it, just like you have to account for the diverse personalities. We were very fortunate in that our top gatekeepers, like a Ray Lewis, Shannon Sharp, Rod Woodson, Jonathan Ogden, all future Hall of Famers, were such quality people, such great players, and understood the one. It was interesting, and Mike, I'm sure, will reiterate that. It's interesting how your best players tend to be those that have the highest respect for coaching and the structure. You would think in some instances that and I'm sure it exists, but there are some players that think they're above that. Well, hey, I'm the best player on the team. I'm a perennial All-Pro. Or I'm going to the Hall of Fame. So we can do it. We can do it whatever way I want to do it. But each of those guys was one that understand, look, we're not going to be successful if we don't have that unified vision and focus for the process. So they relied on me to provide that, and they had to see that I knew what I was talking about. I've always said that whether it's in business or on a football field, your players are in no small degree going to measure your competence based on the goals and the processes you present to them. You can have all the rah-rah, Newt Rockne speeches you want, but they need to see, because even if it's inwardly focused, okay, how are you going to help me? How are you as the coach going to help me get what I want? How are you going to help me get that next contract? My touches, my catches, my tackles, my whatever that quantifies my success, that now I get that next contract. And yes, can we win along the way? Because you got to realize also part of that is the disconnect between the motivations. Not that players don't want to win, don't get me wrong, but there's never been a penny in any contract Mike or I ever signed that gave us a penny for leading the league in offense or defense or whatever. If we won games, we made a whole bunch of money. Where the players, there's not a line in any player's contract in the NFL that they get a dime for winning or losing. They get it for their touches, their catches, their sacks, whatever it is that quantifies their ability. Now, it doesn't mean they don't want to win, but you as a leader have to recognize that motivation and how that can create a disconnect sometime. So you've got to create that structure that they understand that, okay, whatever those motivations are, they can best be achieved by buying into the process and becoming part of the whole. And great players like Ray Lewis and Jonathan Ogden and Shannon Sharp, Rod Woodson, they understood that. And so once they bought in and they could see, okay, yes, these guys know what they're talking about, then it's easy to bring the rest along, so to speak, because they're going to follow those gatekeepers.
I mean, that's really interesting, that I don't think a lot of people, who aren't really in that world don't ever understand that, and I think that's so critical that, a leader really understands all those pieces that really impact the ultimate result and are aware of that. They don't just ignore that, so I think that's really a great bit of information. But okay, we're going to have this 2-minute drill now. This is a short answer question, to both you and Mike, Brian. Okay, like I said, I'm from Cincinnati. I think the Bengals are kind of hopefully going to be a little bit better. They draft Joe Burrow, who clearly, is a quality guy, had a great year at LSU last year. I think they see he can be their leader down the road. First game of the year, playing good, that they eventually get down 3. They're driving the ball. And here he is, Joe's trying to make a play, scrambles out of the pocket, little pressure. He sees a potential receiver 4 or 5 yards down the field, and rather than run it or do whatever he does, he tries to flip it to him and they intercept the pass, So now you as a coach, Joe Burrow walks off the field, and Mike, what do you say to Joe Burrow?
Brian, you take that one first.
It's amazing. Yeah, when you deal with a quarterback, you have to understand the warping effect of actually being on the field. And you have to understand, Cal Ripken Jr. told me that his dad, when he was coaching, never corrected a player when he came right off the field because they're not listening. They're emotionally not in a position to understand what you're saying. He would make a note and he'd address it the next day. It's amazing, a quarterback will come over and you go, well, okay, what did you see? Well, I didn't see the safety. You think? Because you threw it right to him, So that warping effect, you have to understand, in dealing with a player, what can he absorb at the time? And the better time to make those corrections, that teaching opportunity is probably not right then. It is probably later on when you can go back and be more analytical about, okay, well, maybe this would have been a better course of action.
Well, Mike, I know you had, a great rookie quarterback that you drafted at Atlanta. I'm sure you got a little bit of that experience too.
Oh, absolutely. And the big thing with the quarterback is on game day, it's not the time to be making those types of corrections. Like Brian said, it's a completely different atmosphere. Those are the things that you want to bring up on Monday and Tuesday and maybe even on to Wednesday, and address it as a learning situation, and bring it not only to his attention but everybody's attention. To me, the players have to know that you're with them, and especially on game day. That to me, that's the important thing. Most of the corrections have to be done during the week. There's some critical things that happen in a ball game that you have to address, but certain situations you wait till the right time, because it is emotional. I can remember, Brian, I think a great story would be the one when we were up in Cleveland, when they came down, they drove down the field. Can you tell us about that one? I think the people would really love to hear that one.
Yeah, I'm always asked about Ray Lewis and leadership. I think this is the one you're talking about, that Ray Lewis, his natural leader, maybe the best natural leader I've ever been around. So we're playing in Cleveland Browns, and they're terrible. They're not very good. And we think we can get, we were on the way of setting the record for the most shutouts. And my defense was, they were going to get a shutout. They had Spurgeon win at quarterback, and they were terrible. So they were feeling this. We're going to get our shutout. Well, we kick off to them, and we're in Baltimore, and they start the ball on the 14-yard line, and they drive in about 6 or 7 plays the length of the field and score. And so we're just stunned. And so defense is coming off the field. I'm going to walk towards them and do my head coaching thing, whatever that is. And Ray Lewis respectfully comes off and said, "Don't say a word, I've got it." So I kind of turn left to the Gatorade and act like I know what I'm doing. Now, I don't know what Ray said to that group. Keep in mind, we gave up 86 yards in the opening drive. We gave up 112 yards total for the day. So whatever Ray said, it resonated. And that was a classic example of, I could have ranted and raved and done whatever, pulled the blue banner like you do when you're a dumb young coach. But letting Ray communicate that message, understanding what needed to happen to jolt them into focus, was one of the great leadership examples I've seen out of one of the greatest leaders I've ever been around.
Yeah, those are great stories. He just, one of the things that just appears from watching, he just has this incredible presence about him, that I think, is really special quality.
And what Mike will tell you, not to interrupt, but the great thing about Ray Lewis, and Mike worked with him individually as his position coach, so saw it even more. The thing you appreciate about Ray Lewis is what you saw on Sunday, that was Ray. Every single day, every meeting, every lifting session, every practice. I walk in for our team meeting on Wednesday, and there in the front 2 or 3 rows was Ray Lewis. Booked the open, ready to work, ready to be a professional. And that when you have your best player set that tone, and then when you have some young player in the back slouched down with the hoodie up and his book closed, it makes it very easy to go, really? This guy's walking into the Hall of Fame and conducting himself this way, and that's how you're going to act? It's a blessing.
Yeah, that's neat. Okay, let me ask you another question. You guys all both experienced this. So once again, going back to the Bengals game Sunday, they get a chance. They got a chip shot field goal there at the end, and, the kicker misses it. How do you keep the rest of the guys from killing the kicker? Those guys have busted their tails, worked hard, and here you got a kicker who, I'm sure, has not developed the same connection. And I know they all try to do it, but I mean, there's still got to be a little bit of, animosity there when, guys have played their ass off, and then, a kicker misses a field goal that cost them the game.
That was one of the biggest transitions I had to make, because when I became a head coach, I had never worked with kickers. And as we know, they're not football players. They've got a very specialized skill set. They don't meet like players. They don't train like players. They're not called on during game day like other players. And we were very fortunate. When I got to Baltimore, we had a kicker named Matt Stover, phenomenal player, long time in the league. And I screwed it up. I was treating him like any other players, chewing on him, and when he had missed that field goal. And Matt came in, and Matt to this day is one of the closest players that I still keep in touch with, oddly enough. But he sat down and said, "Coach, this isn't going to work, okay? You've got to understand what my world's about, what I need to get my job done, because going about it," and he was absolutely right. And we created a structure with one another, both on game day and during the season, that gave me a better appreciation for the job that he had to do. And we instituted a thing at the end of practice on Friday where we had a running bet and guys could do side bets. It got quite pricey, to where I'd a player at the end of practice on Friday, when everything's done, to come out and kick field goals from 10, 15, and 20 yards, 20-yard line. So you're talking about a 30, a 35, and a 40-yard field goal, or a 35-yard field goal. And they'd bet on it, and I would pay. You know, if you make it, it's $500. And I did that because I won, and they came out and it was pathetic. Balls spraying all over the place, and because I wanted them to see, you know, this chip shot you keep talking about. That's without a rush, and the game's not on the line. That's why I put the money on there to try to, you know, incite a little bit of, you know, pressure that way. And so just a small little way, and they appreciated it. There were frustrations. Yeah, because they're out there in training camp and it's 100 degrees and they're sweating, and they look over there and the kicker and the punter and maybe a backup quarterback are standing around kicking balls, you know? So yeah, there's a hidden, you know, agenda there sometimes, that a little resentment, but they, you know, and it's incumbent upon that player to integrate himself within the club as well, which Matt did, and won us a lot of games. So that balance in there was a big part of it.
Yeah, Brian's hit it right on the head, Doc. You know, punters and kickers, they are not football players, but they are so important to the game. We had a great one at Atlanta, and Matt Bryant, and you know, you just got to kind of let them do their thing. Their practice schedule is completely different, and I think that's what you'll learn as a coach, and I think it's a good takeaway there, that you can't treat everybody the same. You have to treat people fairly, but you can't treat everybody the same on your football team. And I think that's one of the things that Brian did a great job of, was you know, understanding that and understanding how to work with the players to make sure that they were ready to go. But I do want to finish it off with this one, Brian, back to your kicking. The biggest scam that we ever had, probably the greatest thing, was the Tony Saragusa kicking. I got to tell this story, Doc. I think you guys will really appreciate this one. So, you know, Brian had the setup where we kicked on Fridays at the end of practice. Well, for about the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season, everybody would be over there partaking in the field goals, getting their side bets and all that. And there was Saragusa over there on a field by himself practicing, and he was kicking the ball and he was flubbing it right down the middle of the field. Couldn't get it airborne, you know, and he did this for about 3 or 4 weeks. And finally he came to Brian after 3 or 4 weeks and said, Brian, you know, pick me. I want to kick the field goal this week. I want to kick the field goal this week. And I know Brian was thinking, there's no way in hell Tony Saragusa is going to make this field goal. You know, so I'm sure Brian was thinking, hey, I ain't going to have to pay the $500 this week. There's no way he's going to make it. So Goose got the big setup. He got Brian to pick him. Well, Goose had all these side bets. There's no telling how much money they were betting. And lo and behold, nobody knew this, but Tony Saragusa was a kicker in high school, straight on kicker. And he had it set up, and he could nail those things. He could have been your backup kicker. In fact, I think he was at the University of Pittsburgh. He had all the money going, and he had the bets, and he hit that thing right through the uprights. I mean, it was the biggest sting that I'd ever seen, and that was the way Goose rolled.
Yeah, but there's a follow-up to that. So I knew once I saw that he had suckered me in, and the minute he made it, he looked at me, because I used to, when a player would make it, I'd say, okay, double or nothing if you hit it again. Can you do it twice? And they usually would take the bet and miss. So Goose makes it and turns to me and says, don't give me that double or nothing stuff. I'm not buying it. I'm not doing it. I said, what if I move you up 5 yards? And he couldn't help himself. So he moved it up 5 yards and shanked it off the side. That was as mad as I've ever seen a player.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Doc, those are the types of things that you do for a football team. That's something that I took to Atlanta. You know, those are things that people don't realize are team building. And I think that's one thing that Brian did a great job teaching the coaches and the players that you've got to have some levity about you. You got to be able to laugh at yourself. Yeah, it's serious, and it's a tough job being a player and a coach in the NFL. But that's one thing that I think all the guys that work with Brian will tell you. It was always fun every day. Now we'd have some arguments, we'd have some scrimmages in the team meeting rooms and in the staff rooms, but when it was time to roll, we rolled. And probably one of the best staffs, as Brian said, the number of guys that went on to be head coaches, probably one of the best staffs ever put together. And it's been a pleasure, Brian, talking with you today. Hopefully we'll do this again. And yeah, it's always fun. And get up there and catch some more fish. The walleye should be rolling.
We'll do it.
Yeah, Brian, thanks so much for doing this. I think it's been great. And, we try to get a couple takeaways from every one of these podcasts. And I think two great takeaways is, the one that you said, as a leader, you have to have success. You have to figure out a way to build in ways to have success, small victories, those sort of things. I think that's critically important. And then the other thing you guys talked about is, you really can't treat everybody the same. If the backup, outside linebacker said to you after that Cleveland deal, let me take care of it, you may not said, oh, okay, you take care of it. But when it was Ray Lewis, okay, I got you, Ray. So I think, treating people with what they need, you give them what they need. I think that's really, really important. So I think those are really two great thoughts. And, but tell me a little bit too. Mike told me you got a book coming out. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was interesting. I've written 5 books. Most recent, a gentleman named Jim Dale approached me 2 years ago, prior to the 2018 draft, and a longtime Baltimore Ravens fan, kind of a novice as obviously a football man. But he was intrigued with the idea, as we had in Baltimore, struggled with, getting a quarterback. Why is it so hard? Why is it so many teams miss? And the 2018 draft was supposedly this best since, a couple of decades, since the 1983 draft, because there were going to be potentially 5 quarterbacks taken, which eventually is what happened. So what we did was we, over the last 2 years, we tracked more about the process, investigating how can we make the process a little bit better? And it doesn't, just incrementally. It's like in business. I mean, you bat 525 versus 500. That's a world of difference. So how do we get incrementally better? What do we learn from it? So we tracked, by way of the process, these players, what we thought coming in, how they were drafted, where they went, and now how they perform. And drawing some conclusions, and I'm putting together a podcast as well, some interesting observations from people like Ozzie Newsome, Bill Polian, Archie Manning, Kurt Warner, a number of people that have been through this process that recognize, particularly at the quarterback position, it's a 50-50 proposition. That's what history tells us. And so what is it about the process that we can improve on so that we increase, even incrementally, the success rate in choosing these quarterbacks? And certainly has business principles, because obviously a big part is hiring your top leadership group and finding those qualities in that leadership that are going to communicate and translate into the success for your organization. So yeah, the book comes out in September. It's called The Q Factor, and we're proud of it. There's some things in there that, it will be informative and also lead to maybe some discussion and thought.
No, that sounds great. I think that's one of the things, as me and my background, as I hire coaches and hire staff, that's always something that's been interesting to me is, what are the competencies that you look for in people that will, kind of lead them to be successful. Might as well, my doctoral dissertation was the effect of coaching styles on self-concepts of athletes. And we kind of looked at, try to see if coaching styles and self-concepts, and then looked at other variables, to see what impacted, the self-concept of athletes. But I think that's really a very interesting topic of, what are those characteristics, and, really get into, some pretty significant background work on, what are those qualities or characteristics, and what is the process you need to go through. So I'm really anxious to see that and read that, you know.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it was fun doing, and it's fun to see it out and interacting. Again, I'm doing podcasts on interacting with different people, getting their take on the subject and observations, and it's been fun.
Yeah, Brian. So we're very interested in getting some information about your podcast that's coming out. Can you give us some information to tell our listeners where they can get the opportunity to take it in?
Yeah, the book comes out in late September, and the podcast will follow not long after it. And I'm basically doing an 8-part series that once we did the book itself and all the things integrated into the Q Factor, which was basically analysis of the process of drafting quarterbacks that we get so wrong in the NFL. I mean, how, as a league, and I don't mean this to be critical of an individual club, how do you take Mitchell Trubisky number 1 and then take Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson 10 and 12? How do we take a Josh Rosen number 10 and a Lamar Jackson number 32? And it's a league-wide. How does that happen? So it's an analysis of the process itself. And what's been very fun is now with the podcast, I'm reaching out to a number of individuals, some who helped with the book, a lot that are seeing the material for the first time, and getting their take on, okay, what do you see in the process, which involves obviously the identification, the procurement by way of the draft, and the development. It's all 3 phases. And how at the quarterback position, it's so difficult to quantify the traits that make up a great quarterback. If you and I, Mike, were to sit and list the top 10 quarterbacks of all time, we'd probably come up with 12 or 13 names. But if we went through that, okay, what makes them a great quarterback? Different attributes, different combinations of attributes. It's not a one, well, they're all 6'4" and they all can throw it 90 yards, and they're all, you know, whether it's the fluid release of a Warren Moon, the athleticism in the pocket and the touch of a Joe Montana, the intellect of a Peyton Manning or a Tom Brady, the sheer ability to throw the ball with the quick release of a Dan Marino. It's a sliding scale, and identifying that and visiting with a number of different people, including those people, and visiting with Archie Manning. What a great conversation we had when you talk about a guy that came out that was the entire package. He was as good as anybody that's come out. He was the 2nd pick in the 1971 draft, but he went to the New Orleans Saints, the wrongest team in the history of football to that date. And so how these attributes in the wrong place are affected. And we tell some great stories. That too will come out in about mid-September, whether it's on Amazon, Google, any number of places that you can find the Q Factor, both the book and the podcast.
Yeah. Brian, I'm looking forward to listening to those conversations. That's some great guests that you're going to have.